So good morning also from my side. Thanks everybody for participating yesterday, and I'm looking forward to get your feedback for today's session. So first of all, thanks to Robert, who created also a M1-based image for RDS Local. So if you want to try this on your shiny new M1-based Mac, Robert has you covered. He put some comments in the Slack channel. Yeah, maybe Robert, you might want to also put this again in this chat if you are, if you want to share that as well again. So today I would like to show you a couple of things about a local RDS instance, how to customize that. So the slides will mostly be a repetition of yesterday, but as I said yesterday, also there are a couple of links to the RDS repository, and I will show a couple of things, where to find various places for customizing things. What we will cover very quickly is general templates and configurations. We will look at forms, how to customize forms for authoring your OData, editorial workflows, again, lookup, and we will quickly see Open Refine and also how app development works in general. As we only have half an hour, as I said, this will basically just a very quick walkthrough, mostly to provide you pointers to look at that later on. And if you have questions, you can always jump in and ask. So first of all, just some general hints. So templates, what I mean by templates, when I look at such a system, each of those pages is a template that you can customize. Florian showed this yesterday quickly. There's always an edit button everywhere. You can just go there and change stuff if you're an admin. Of course, you would not do this on the RDS global system, so I'm not changing anything here. I rather have my own RDS local instance. This is in my instance currently running on AWS, but you could also run this on your own local notebook or somewhere else. But this is deployed using the same mechanism that Florian showed yesterday using Docker Compose, just in the public cloud. And I can also just go there to the, this is now the start page, which has that search. I could just go there, edit that, and change things. Sometimes this is the main editor for for editing templates. You'll see this is mostly HTML based, and there are also some includes that you find here. There's a lot to that syntax, a lot of options, but you can basically treat this as an HTML page. This is all documented in the help. So I just pointed into the slides, which will be shared with you. Also, I gave a documentation pointer to the help start page. Just be aware, currently this in your own local instance, you can just go to that help link and find the documentation in your own document, in your own system as well. So everything should be documented there. You'll find a wealth of information about everything that you can add to your own system, modify there. This is a lot of general platform help, right? So there are a lot of topics to cover. We are not going to cover all of that. Just when you're looking for anything, try to consult the documentation here. Also, if you're running your own local RDS local instance, please make sure to change the admin password, even if you just expose it on your own notebook or whatever. It's just good security practice to change admin to something else. So the main thing that you might want to change once you are working on something is likely modifying the forms for authoring data. I have a couple of links. So we do have those predefined forms. We will quickly have a look at those. Let's go there. So this is an example of such a page that Florian quickly also showed yesterday for editing a new person. And this is a semantic form component that refers to so-called field definitions. And those are enumerated here. So each of the fields in the form are described using a mechanism called field definitions, which basically say, okay, this is a text field or a field which refers to another entity, and you give the type of the entity and so on. You can define your own fields, of course, either by editing this name graph file that we imported in the session yesterday, but that's a bit more involved once you start proper app development. But if you just want to do this on the fly with your system, one way to do this in your own instance, you can go to Asset Fields, and there you get a list of all the field definitions that we have there. So just as an example, Let's go to create a role. That's one of those fields. And you see you have a label for that, some identifier. This is what is being referred to in that form that we just looked at. You can define the target type. In this case, it's just a string, but you could also say this is pointing to an object of a certain type, and then you can define the range and so on. You can also define, okay, this has to exist at least once, or it's optional. Then you would have min cardinality 0. You can decide, say you allow multiple values of this, and you would set the max cardinality to something greater 1, and so on. The one important piece besides giving a good identifier and the label that so you can easily find those fields is, in the end, everything is persisted using Sparkle. So when you want to insert a value, depending on the modeling, which in this case is following the CyDoc CRM ontology, you have to define how to store that value. In the simplest case, you would always just say subject, your predicate, and the value for that. That would be the very simplest case. With CyDoc CRM, the modeling is a bit more complex because you are not always store values directly on the actual entity you're editing, but rather on some intermediate objects. So that's why, for example, in this you have some intermediate element, but that's but still you can construct any kind of modeling, data modeling that you want. Just be aware, the insert pattern, of course, you need for creating data, but also when editing data. Editing in RDF world typically means you need to delete the previous value and then insert a new one, because you can also have multiple values, right? So that's why you need the insert pattern and the delete pattern, and also to show the current value, the select pattern. So in most cases, you would have those 3 tiny Sparkle patterns. There are more ways you can, more things you could do, like, for example, some validation. If you're, for example, only allowing certain constructs, or you have to have some references to somewhere else in your graph, and so on. There's a lot to this topic. What I wanted to show here is basically that there's a nice UI for that, and there's also a very deep documentation on that. Again, let me show that. If you go to the help page, and then there's forms, and forms in general with all those types of form elements, like do you have an auto completion, or which does some search or lookup? Do you have some date input or number input or text input and whatnot? All of this is covered in this documentation page. We again have the field definitions, and then we have all those form fields described also with some examples a bit further down. This is extensive documentation, so there's a lot to it, but it also has a lot of flexibility. So just a couple of pointers to get you started. And just to complete this, these field definitions, here this is the form which refers to those fields in a certain order in this case. And we can quickly look at those field definitions which we imported yesterday. This is on GitHub, right? The whole RDS project is public, so you can just look at all the code there for all the apps. We are now looking at, there are actually 2 GitHub projects. One is for RDS, the main part, and then there's one for RDS local. This is the one that you used yesterday for cloning and or downloading and running your own instance. And in the configuration, we have this field definitions. That's what we imported yesterday, what Florian showed you how to import. And there are all those field definitions contained. So we can have a look at the single one. So let's just take any. No, this, yeah. RDF sometimes makes it a bit difficult to read that. So this uses blank notes. So you would have to look at this in a combined way, or in different presentation where blank notes are inline. So it's not easy to look at in this representation. There are different serialization variants, which makes it easier to read. But anyway, typically for each field, you would have such a block of RDF data, because also the fields are described themselves in RDF. That's the main takeaway. And once you have defined fields yourself, for example, using this editor that I just showed you, you can just export that. This is what was also done by Florian and SmartUp to define all those fields. So just define them inline as you go, work on them until they are correct, and then you can export the whole set of elements in one go and import that, or prepare that, for example, for other systems to import. So much about form creation or records. And I want just to highlight once more the documentation page of the Swiss Art Research for the SARI reference data model. So this is what is pre-set up in RDS Local. And you see all those entities are described also in great detail. There's a lot of information there about the modeling, how it relates to the various data sets and so on. So feel free to find some inspiration there and look up what is meant by the various fields that are predefined, but you can also take this as a reference on how to go about modeling your own extensions or alternative representations. So editorial workflows. Yesterday we covered, for example, here this editorial workflow. I can show you also how this looks like. So I go to my workspace. I go to a record that I created or that was created in my system. In the authoring tab, here I see the workflow is already completed in this case because it's already accepted. So you cannot change it anymore afterwards in this variant of the workflow. But typically the steps that are there that are predefined, they are also available in the data. So if we again look at our, sorry for the switching between tabs. If we look again at the data that we imported yesterday, we also have this editorial workflow. Sorry, this is contained in the user roles. This is one part. We have some user roles. There's an editor role and an admin role that you can assign to a user. And this is basically also the definition of a person or in the editor role, which has those users as members. These users here are really platform users. So the admin user that I use to log in, or a secondary editor user that you could create. And if you have further users that you want to assign to this role of editor, you can add those users in addition. So those are groups. These are users that you can create using the regular user management. I can also show that one for a second, just so you also know how to change your password. I go to admin, user security, and there I have those users, and I can define roles and everything. Here you see the RDS editor role. This is what we were talking about with the editorial workflows. The workflow steps, we can also have a quick look. Those are contained. No, this is the wrong repository again. Sorry for that.
Send you the page in the chat, Wolfgang.
Thanks.
Because it's in the RDS repository.
Yeah, I was just hunting for that. I didn't look it up before. Sorry for that. Where is it? My window is too small. There. Thanks, Florian. So here we have those steps defined in progress, ready to review and re-review and so on. This is the overall steps, and this defines all those individual steps and what the next steps are and how to find possible assignees. So those assignee queries are also defined here. This basically just gives you a higher flexibility when doing those assignments. So let's get back there to show this again. The authoring tab. Here, this assignee, when I'm in some state, I would be able to find a possible set of assignees, and this can be defined using this query that we just looked at. So you can very flexibly define your own workflows and extend that, which steps you want to have in your workflow, and what are the state transitions from one step to another, and also how to identify the users that you can assign a certain step. For example, based on some membership data that you also have in your RDF database, like we do have in this example. So that's the high-level quick run through of the editorial workflows. Again, we are not going much deeper because that would take way more time and we have a couple of more things to cover. Next thing I want to show once more is the lookup configuration. So this is the architecture image, but I would rather show again this RDS lookup architecture. So again, we have the RDS global system, we have RDS local system, and what does such a lookup mean? So to look at that, we go to the repository configuration, again, admin repositories, because a lookup service is typically associated with the repository. So the default repository is your main database. If you compare this again with that architecture picture, that would be this database in your RDS local system or this one in RDS global. And even though there usually is a lookup service associated with that, we are not actually using this. We are trying to auto-discover whether this is Placecraft and then automatically use the Placecraft specific implementation. But this is only done for the default implementation. So this one we are ignoring in this case, but rather we have a specific configuration, which is the default lookup service. So you see, this is again a repository, in this case, a memory repository. So this is just a placeholder that we need in the configuration. We don't care here. Instead, we say we use the Sparkle-based lookup, which requires some templating. And this allows us to define the actual search query. So I was pointing this out yesterday quickly. We are using Placecraft's lookup service here, not lookup service, full text search service, which is looking for a certain token. This will be injected with the token value that you enter in your search. And the search could be the Google-like search that we had on the start page, but also when, for example, creating records, when you, for example, create a person record and you're referring to another person, like the father or mother of the person or so, and you start typing there, this auto-completion uses the same mechanism under the hood. And this is where you can flexibly change things or adjust things also. So here, for example, we do this type translation, where given those type mappings that we discussed yesterday from, for example, the RDS person type to all those underlying GND person, Wikidata, human, and whatnot in the various data sets. This is done in this translation, in this type mapping layer, and this is included here. And you also see we are also looking for various labels expressed in our own models. And this is where it's relevant for when modifying our own records. For example, using those forms that we just showed previously, if you modify that and adjust or add additional fields or additional models, especially the ones where you would be searching for, like a name, any representation of a name. SciDoc CRM has a bit complex modeling here, where you would have not just a name directly attached to an entity, but rather you would use an appellation or some identifier. And this might also have further language specific construct and so on. So here you might also want to adjust this in that case. That's rather advanced. So in most cases, you would not need this, but if you need it, this is where you would look. But the more interesting stuff here is, besides the local database lookup, we also have the remote lookup. This goes to RDS Global, just so you've seen this one. There's a remote lookup, and this looks in RDS Global. Of course, if you had multiple RDS local instances, you could just add additional ones like these, and just also look up in various other repositories. So this is where you could hook in any other additional system. You could just copy this configuration, create a secondary one, tertiary one, how many you need, and then you just insert them in the federation. Here you see this is referring to the default lookup and the remote lookup, and this will get us this picture. So we were just looking at this one, and the federation, and any search goes into the federation in the RDS local instance, and then this is distributed over all the participating things. There's just one tiny distinction. So this is again the start page of my local instance, and here it says RDS local, only search RDS local. In this case, it would go directly to just this configuration, and where it says RDS global, it would go just to this configuration. So we can mix and match as we need to search for the unified view or just the local or just the remote one. So there's a lot of flexibility there. And just one last thing about that remote federation endpoint. Let's go there again, repositories. Not remote federation, remote lookup. This is also the URL that you would use for example, for any external REST-based access to this system, for example, from OpenRefine, which we'll see a bit later. So this is about Lookup and OpenRefine. This is what I will quickly show now. OpenRefine, what is OpenRefine? OpenRefine is a tool that allows us to do data integration, basically processing of data that allows us to load CSV or XML or JSON-based data sets. And for example, do some cleanup steps, cleanup processing, unifying values, and so on. And what's interesting to us here is, in the context of RDS, that sometimes you might have names of people, for example. And those names you might want to reconcile against their RDS global system to get canonical identifiers. Like, for example, the Wikidata-based IRI. And this you can do with OpenRefine. And OpenRefine looks like this. For the people who've never seen this, let's start again from scratch. What you can do, for example, is you can load some CSV file. I have here a file of writers, which just has some names. So what, in this case, I would want to do is I just want to get the Wikidata or canonical identifier on any of those repositories that we have in RDS. What I can do then, sorry, I have to create a project. What I can do then is I can reconcile this, start reconciling against an endpoint. In this case, for example, this is RDS Global. So what you can do is you can just enter the URL that is specified here. This one, RDS Global, or you can do this with your own local system. You can also set up RDS without ResearchNet. You can also use your local host or whatever your host name is of your own instance, and use that one as a service. And then you can reconcile against that. What this will do is it will discover various things from the service, what supported types are there, and so on. Then you can just let it reconcile. What reconciliation will do is it's now for each of those lines, ask the other system, please find your candidates, lookup candidates. That's basically like you would search for each of those entries individually, one by one, in the lookup service, and it will give you some results. And you will also get some description shown that would help you in reconciling. So a tiny walkthrough is documented. If I can go again on the RDS system, the help page, there's this lookup service page, documentation, I mean. And on the bottom of that, let me scroll down a bit, there's a tutorial how that works. So what I just started showing, unfortunately, there's not enough time, but on the bottom of the page, oh, come on. Here, OpenRefine integration, and there's a mini tutorial how that works, and you can see this as a step-by-step guide how this works, and then you can look at those candidates. And here also, when looking at each individual candidate, you get the description when hovering, and it will show you the description also when you need to disambiguate. And you can either then, when doing this reconciliation using the auto match, like shown here, it would pick the one with the highest score, or you can do this individually and also still switch candidates. So this is something, if you have a couple of hundred entries and you're feeling for the score-based auto matching is good enough, you can just do this as a batch operation. Just be advised that OpenRefine is not so fast, so be prepared to wait a bit for that. This is nothing you would do interactively for a couple of thousand entries. This will take a bit of time. But still, you can use this to reconcile a big number of entries against RDS. For example, to fetch the identifier and the description and the label of some entity and get the canonical label, for example. So this is what I just mentioned. Here's also the link to the tutorial on the lookup page, service page, so you can read up on that in your own time if you want. Here you also see, for example, the description if you have ambiguous results, so you can see, is this the right entity that I found here, and so on. So this you can do. I entered the URL of RDS Global, but of course you can do the same to your own RDS local instance, because that would include your own data then for referencing. And depending on how you configure this URL, it would either use the federated one, which searches both your local system and RDS Global while going via RDS Local, or just the local one. So you're very flexible in this regard, what you can do. And the one interesting thing is this API that we're using here is an API that is in process of being standardized. So this is a reconciliation service API, which is basically a W3C community group, which defines this API. This is still in process, so this is work in progress, but this is taking the OpenRefine API and standardizing this. And this also allows integrating other tools. So Florian found another one, which is this TEI editor, which can also be used to talk to the same endpoint. And there are quite a few operations, and I can show you this again in my own local instance. There's a page called API here under admin API, which shows the local REST endpoints that are offered by our own service. And here you can also find the reconciliation APIs. So this is the, no, this is the wrong one, not this one. This is the main one that we are using here. So if you're searching for a certain language, a preferred language, and give the request body as a string, so basically the keyword, this is how you can call it. You can just try this also interactively. So if you're also building your own application, so I think Robert is playing a lot with Python-based stuff. So this is also how you can hook up additional services to your own instance or the RDS global system. And if this goes to the main reconciliation endpoint, which in our RDS example is, if I may switch again, this federated aggregation endpoint here in the RDS global system, or in your own instance, also going the one via the remote lookup to RDS global and the local one. This is the main one that is typically used, but you can also use a variant of that endpoint and also give the name of that lookup. So this is the one where you had default minus lookup or federated lookup and so on. So you can also define which one you use. So for example, for RDS global, we also have RDS global. We also have various lookup services defined per data set. So there's a ULAN lookup, there's an AAT lookup, and those are restricted to just those data sets, for example. And if you want to do something similar, this is how you can do it. And also wherever we integrated lookup, so in the main search, but also in forms, in the auto completion, for example, or in the search also, you can always define also the lookup service name, and that directs you to use this or that specialized lookup for just the data set or some other kind of configuration. So there's a lot of flexibility in this, which allows you switching between things and using the building blocks to combine them in various ways. So on to the last topic I want to cover. So apps. What is an app? An app is basically a collection of artifacts that you can either build interactively in your own system, or you can build them using some development environment. But in the end, this is a combination of templates, configuration, sometimes data, and some other pieces that you can put together in a single container, which is a zip file, and call that an app, and you can install that into a ready-made image of the platform. So RDS Local is basically the Metaphacts community platform plus the branding app, the services app, and the RDS Global app for RDS Global, sorry. And for local, it's the RDS Local app on top of the RDS services and branding app. Those apps, the branding app basically defines this surrounding stuff like the header and the footer and the colors and stuff like that. Whereas the RDS services app, I actually have that written down, provides some Java-based extensions, like for example, this aggregation mechanism that we have here, aggregation and grouping, but also the push implementation. When I'm pushing records, this has a bit of code to collect the various records together, that the ones that are approved only, puts them together in a single named graph and pushes this to RDS Global. This is also a small Java extension in this case. And the RDS Global, RDS Local apps respectively have basically the templates that are used to define this start page and also the record creation forms and so on. This is contained in those apps. If you want to build your own instance based on RDS, but maybe without that RDS branding. Just as an example, what you could do is you can just take those other apps and skip that one. Or if you want to extend the system to have your own forms, extended forms, which allow more form fields or different form fields, different modeling, what you can also do is you can interactively build that in a running system, export that, and also build your own app out of that. Florian is going to show this a bit in more detail later on. And yeah, but this is what I wanted to show so far. So that was a lot of stuff in a very short time and only scratching the surface. I hope that made you curious and also gave some ideas on what's possible with regard to implementing extensions. Are there any questions so far?